I think we can start.
Okay. Hello and welcome everyone. I hope I am audible. I am Yachna Kabra, second year medical student and executive member of Doctors for a Cause. Doctors for a Cause is a non-governmental, non-profitable organization working towards the welfare of the society in general. We seek to spread education, awareness and goodwill one step at a time. We are a body of medical students, interns and young doctors based primarily out of Kolkata. So welcome to the day 2 of our 3-day radiology masterclass by Dr. Tirthankar Guha Thakurta. Our previous masterclass lectures have been uploaded on our YouTube channel. You can go and check them out. I think we are good to go. Sir, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Yachna. So I hope I'm audible to everyone. In our previous session, we discussed about the interpretation of chest X-ray. And in today's session, we are here to discuss about the very basic principles of understanding how a brain image can be interpreted. Now, CT scan is basically a modified X-ray, where instead of a 2D picture, you are getting sections and which can later on be reconstructed into a 3D picture. MRI scan has an entirely different principle of operation, but the images, particularly on the T1 weighted signals, are very similar. So I will discuss CT scan as the basis for a discussion, and the differences between CT and MRI images I'll try to cover tomorrow before I start off with the new section. So here we start. So see, when we are going to interpret the brain image through CT scan or magnetic resonance imaging, the first thing we need to understand is, as I always tell about any imaging study, that you are diagnosing the patient and not just the image. So it is very important that you have a clinical history, you have some idea about what the patient is suffering from, if possible, the physical findings and the drug history. And in the light of that, you interpret the image and come to a diagnosis. As I already mentioned, that every interpretation of a radiological film is essentially a consultation. So it should be taken in the form of a consultation. So the film alone may not give you as much information as the whole patient's information along with the film can give. So always correlate clinically, and then your diagnosis will be much easier. Now, what is the basic approach in understanding a CT image? If we simplify this, you will see that when we are trying to interpret a CT scan image, there are a few issues that will come to your mind. The first thing, as in all cases of neurology, is we find that neuroanatomy dominates over the physiology in most cases, because to locate the pathology, you need to know where the pathology lies. So one of the most important parameter to see when you are going through the CT scan image is not only what is wrong, but also where is it wrong. And when you know both answers, you actually synthesize your diagnosis and you come to a radiological or a clinical diagnosis. So once these two things are totally clear to you, this will lead you to a radiological diagnosis. So that is why when you look at the CT scan image, it is important to know what you are looking at. What does that white dot represent? What does this dark shadow represent? So anatomical localization, and then comes the pathophysiological categorization. Am I looking at a hemorrhage? Am I looking at a tumor? Am I looking at an infarction? Am I looking at an atrophy? Am I looking at a calcification? And when you bridge them together, you get the combined diagnosis. So the diagnosis will sound something like brainstem infarction, calcification of basal ganglia, like hemorrhage in the subarachnoid space. So once the anatomy and the pathology are both clear, then together the radiological diagnosis also becomes very easy. So in today's class, what we'll do is, therefore, we will first review the basic neuroanatomy through sectional images of the CT scan. So the first part will be on anatomy. Also understand, I have seen this as a student, also while teaching students, that you put a lot of stress on unnecessary details of anatomy on a CT scan. While that is actually important from an academic point of view, for diagnosis, it does not really matter. You should be able to know at which plane the section was taken and what are the key structures and their relationships. That is quite sufficient for a radiological diagnosis. So talking first about the anatomy, and then we will talk about the disorders and their manifestation and how they look like. So I will start with the anatomy portion. Now, as you understand that in CT scan, when we take an image, we are actually doing a sectional anatomy. You are cutting through the head and the including the brain, and this entire section comes to you as a 2D plate. So you must understand at which level, in which plane, at which angle the section was done, and therefore you should also correlate with the 3D anatomy as to which parts have been cut. To understand this is actually a very challenging part. So to understand this portion, I will first talk about how CT scan images look like, what are the principles of taking sections, and then I will proceed with this further. See, the technique basically is that the patient goes into the machine, and from various angles, you emit the X-ray, and through a computerized interface, you analyze this data, and you get 3-dimensional or 2-dimensional representation of the sections. Now, as in the X-ray images or skyogram, air and rarer structures appear black, and bone and calcified structures appear white. We use the words hypodense and hyperdense for these colors, and they range through a scale of -1000 to around +3000 or +1000, and this is the scale basically. So air will be extremely black, cortical bone will be very white, CSF, white and gray matter lies somewhere in between. So beyond CSF, you will get clotted blood, then you will get blood, and then you will get cortical bone. Sometimes you see, although this distinction looks very good, this was the distinction initially designed by Hounsfield, but the problem is human eye cannot recognize between so many shades of gray. So sometimes when we are focused on a particular element, like I want to see blood or I want to see bone, we can deliberately shift the color intensity by a software in such a manner that only that portion appears white and rest of the portion appears black. If you don't understand this, forget about it. Think of this as a basic photoshopping or editing, by which you enhance the color of certain structure and you make the rest of the structure black. That way certain structures stand out, and this mechanism is known as windowing. So several windowing mechanisms are there. They're all software-based mechanisms where you can digitally shift the grayness or the whiteness of an image, making one part more clear and the other part darker. So as I was talking about sections, as we move through the sections, it's important to know in what order the sections are done. So the patient is lying in the CT scan machine. The radiological convention is that the radiologist is standing towards the foot end of the patient. So you are standing towards the feet. You are looking towards the head. And you are taking the section from neck upwards or from the mouth upwards. So from below upwards, you are taking the section. So at first you are getting section of the base of the brain, then the middle of the brain, then the top of the brain. That is the convention. And because you are facing the patient with the patient lying in front of you, so similar to X-ray, your right side is patient's left side and your left side is patient's right side. So a very basic protocol is followed. The left-right conventions are same as X-ray. Your left is patient's right and your right is patient's left. Second, you are facing the person from the foot end and the sections are taken from below upward. That is the convention. Now, keeping these things in mind, let us understand how the brain sections actually look like under different sections. This actually requires a lot of practice to identify, but I'm sure that you will be able to understand if we correlate this with the 3D anatomy of the brain. As for any anatomical hallmark, even in dissection, there are certain indicators or certain compasses that help us identify the other structures. Now, CT scan images or MRI images in a way are very bland. They are all black, gray and white. There is no coloring of the images. So identification of the structures actually can become very difficult. We take the ventricular system or the CSF chamber of the brain as the compassing system. If we can identify the CSF chamber, it is easy to remember the surrounding structure. And that is how, using the CSF chamber as the prototype or as the indicator of the anatomy, we will study the sectional anatomy of the brain. So let us proceed. This is the section of the brain I will use throughout my discussion so that you can corroborate with the morbid anatomy and understand the CT scan images. So if you see this picture, you can easily understand. See, we usually start taking a section along this plane. I'm just drawing an arbitrary line so that you understand. So this is usually the initial section. And then gradually the sections move up like this. So more or less sections are taken along this inclination and along this plane. So in this way you go up. So as you go up, you see from this structure, at various cross section, various structures will be visible. Say for example, if this is the first section, you will first be able to see a piece of the brainstem, mainly the pons or lower medulla. Then pieces of temporal lobe will also be visible on both sides. A small slice of cerebellum will come at the back, and a small slice of the frontal lobe will come in the foreground. So in this way, as you go through this diagram, you will be able to understand how sectioning is done and which structures will be visible and which will be not. As landmarks of this structure, we take the CSF chambers. So quickly reviewing through the CSF chambers, you see the cerebrospinal fluid is mainly secreted from or filtered from the choroid plexus. It is also partly secreted directly by the ependymal cells. Now the CSF from the lateral ventricles drain into the third ventricle. Then it comes down through the cerebral aqueduct. Then it enters the fourth ventricle, and then it goes down into the spinal cord, into the central canal, and also throughout the brain. Also remember that these structures are 3D, so they project laterally as well, not only vertically, but also laterally they project. Like the lateral ventricles have lateral horns going anteriorly and posteriorly. So these are the CSF chambers, and we refer to the structures in relation to the CSF chambers. Also importantly, you notice two particular structures. You can see here that here you have the pituitary. Since this is the pituitary, this must be the sella turcica. Therefore, this area that contains the CSF around the pituitary This is the suprasellar cistern, a small collection of CSF. Similarly, this is the pons, this is the medulla, this is the midbrain. So when we say midbrain, they consist of the different corpora quadrigemina. So the space behind this, is also the quadrigeminal plate cistern, a small collection of CSF behind the midbrain. So these are the important cisterns that help us in locating the level of the brain. We will come back to this in greater detail much later. So let us now talk one by one about how we can section the brain and what are the structures that we're going to see. So this is the initial section. Compare this with the brain image I have shown here. So as you can see, the structure goes straight from the beginning. So then it goes and continues into the sphenoidal sinuses. Then it goes further behind and it cuts through the brainstem somewhere in the junction of pons and medulla. And then it goes behind further, taking a piece of the cerebellum. And then it further goes behind, taking a bit of the bone. So ideally in the section, these are the structures that should be visible. Look into the morbid anatomy here. What is not shown in the sagittal section is on both sides, we have the temporal lobe hanging. So even the temporal lobe will be cut on both sides, apart from the structures that we have described. Let us see if we can identify them one by one. There is no need to understand all the structures, but there are some that you can easily understand. I'm labeling them so that you can easily recollect. So for example, this is the frontal bone, quite obviously. Now it cuts through the frontal air sinuses. Obviously, this is the eyeball in the orbit. Now you see, you look at this structure and see these gray areas are the brain matters. Now look into the section. Posteriorly, you are cutting through the cerebellum. So this must be the cerebellum. Laterally, you are cutting through the temporal lobe. So these two portions, almost symmetrical portions, must be the temporal lobes. Understand that therefore this area must be the brain stem, either the lower pons or upper medulla. I'm writing pons, but it's difficult to say at this point whether it is lower pons or upper medulla, but it is definitely some part of that. So I hope this is clear to you. So this is how we identify. Now, once you identify these structures, you can easily understand that this elongated structure that you see here is nothing but the petrous temporal. So if this is the petrous temporal bone, the area labeled by E must be the air sinuses. These are the mastoid air sinuses, or the mastoid air cells. So what I'm trying to tell you is there is nothing to memorize. Once you understand the section, you look at the brain structure and deduce on your own what the structures can be. So anteriorly, we have the frontal bone, then the frontal sinuses. A small amount of brain matter, if it is seen, must be from the frontal lobe. If there is no brain matter, then it's a lower cut section that did not touch the brain. Then you have the sphenoidal sinus, the orbit. On both sides, you must have the temporal lobe. Then as you come behind, you have the petrous temporal with the mastoid air cells. Now looking at the section, you see the line has gone through the cerebellum across the brainstem. So you have the brainstem here and the cerebellum here. Is this clear to everyone? Is this section clear to everyone? Then I'll proceed with the next section. Okay, great. So We then move on to the next section. Let's see. In the next level, you go a bit higher. As you go a bit higher, now you will be able to deduce only. Look at this sagittal section and also this morbid anatomy, and let us guess what these structures can be. See, this line passes through and through the frontal lobe. So, quite obviously, this must be the frontal lobe brain matter. And the bone in front must be the frontal bone. Then, if you see very carefully, you are getting two large bones here. Now, correlate with your anatomy. All of you have the base of the skull in your hand. So maybe this section has just passed over the frontal part of the frontal bone. And that is why these are the frontal areas of the frontal bone which have squamoid appearance. That has come in the section. It's a matter of chance. It might not have come also. Then you gradually go behind. And there you find that, see, look at this section. This section am I audible now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, okay. Actually, the connection is a bit unstable. Okay, so getting back to what we were discussing. So I'm starting from this slide once again. So you see that since this section, in this section, we can see that the section is passing through and through the cerebellum, the pons, the temporal lobes, the pituitary stalk, the frontal lobe, and forward. So we can easily understand if we go through the possible structures that are here. This must be the frontal bone. This must be the frontal lobe. This is also part of the frontal bone. Now, this bony structure that you find here, this bony structure must be the part where you can see in this picture where the pituitary is coming down and resting, and that must be the sella turcica. Here we have the brain stem, and from the section we know we are dealing with the pons. Behind this you can see we have a small aperture. This must be the fourth ventricle or its continuation. And this brain matter that you have here, looking at the section, this is cerebellum. And again, you have the petrous temporal with the mastoid hair cells. Is this clear to everyone? Great. So we move on to the next slide. So you go one step higher. When you go one step higher, now look into how this is cutting through the brain. Anteriorly, you have the frontal bone. Then you have the frontal lobe. Then you are cutting through the brain stem, but now you are at the higher end of the pons. And you are cutting through the matter of cerebellum as well. But you see in between lies the major part of the fourth ventricle. And also, if you look here, I'm pointing this out for you so that it's easy for you to locate. If you look here, it has already gone to the position where the pituitary stalk is almost beginning, which means this is a space around the pituitary stalk where CSF can accumulate. We already named that area. That is the suprasellar cistern. So you look here, this black area, black indicates that it must be either water or gas. So here it's granular black, which is water. So this is CSF. This area, if you look carefully, has a shape like a star. And the star-shaped area is characteristically indicative of the suprasellar cistern of CSF. This indicates that the white dot that you are finding in between, this white dot might be the pituitary stalk. It is possible. Now, there may be multiple white dots here. Be careful with what kind of white dot you are dealing with. Some white dots may represent a calcified choroid plexus, some may indicate an artery, and some may indicate the pituitary. Now, if the dot is in the middle of the suprasellar cistern, it's possibly the pituitary stalk. But if it is posterior to the suprasellar cistern, it's likely to be the basilar artery or a branch of the basilar artery. Nevertheless, it can be either the basilar artery or the pituitary stalk. Then you have the brainstem again. We know that we are cutting through the pons here. This is high pons or lower part of midbrain. Probably pons only. And here you can see that we have gone through major part of the fourth ventricle. So this is the fourth ventricle. And the brain matter that is present here definitely is cerebellum. Is this section clear to all of you? So remember that the star shape indicates the suprasellar cistern. So any hyperdense material, round material inside may be the pituitary stalk, and posterior to it can be the basilar artery. Getting back to the next section. So we have gone one step ahead now. At this stage, you can easily see we are almost crossing the cerebellum now. So a little bit of cerebellum tissue will be here. If you go through the cross-sectional anatomy. So we have the cerebellum here. So therefore, this is cerebellum. Then you also have part of the fourth ventricle here. You can see it here only. But this part is actually above the fourth ventricle, behind the midbrain. And I gave a name to this. This was known as the quadrigeminal plate cistern, because it is in relation with the midbrain, which is also consisting of the corpora quadrigemina. I'm labeling this in the morbid anatomy for you so that it is easy for you to understand. When we say the quadrigeminal plate cistern, this is the part that we refer to. See, this is the fourth ventricle. This is the quadrigeminal plate cistern. So here again, if I go into the morbid anatomy, this is the fourth ventricle. This is the quadrigeminal plate cistern. So this space just above the fourth ventricle, that is behind the midbrain, is the quadrigeminal plate cistern. What does it tell you? It tells you that you are at the level of the midbrain. So the structure that is in front of you must be the midbrain. Am I clear to you now? Now, by this time, you can also see the lateral ventricles have been partly cut. So these small areas that you are finding in the front, this must be the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. And lateral ventricles drain into a central ventricle. This must be the third ventricle. So we are now reaching at the level of the third ventricle. So since we have got the anterior horn of lateral ventricle, we are expecting in the section just above it, you will get a lot of lateral ventricle. Up till this, is this clear to everybody? Is this anatomy clear? Yes, I will use a different color to indicate. Okay. Okay, fine. So we move on to the next section. Look at this section now. This section is way above the pons. And in this section, if you see carefully, it has actually gone above the midbrain. We are at the subcortical structure level. The structures that lie below the cortex, the thalamus, the basal ganglia, all internal capsule, all these structures. We are also cutting through the third ventricle. So a lot of third ventricle should be visible. We are cutting through the lateral ventricle. So the lateral ventricle must be visible. So let us see one by one, what are the structures that we can find here. Let's see. So going by this section, of course, this must be the frontal lobe. Is it visible now, or I'm showing you another color? If I write with white, is that better? So shall I write with green or white? Which one is easier on your screen? Okay, I'll write with white only. So you see that if you now look at this structure, what you are seeing here is a major part of the lateral ventricles. Also understand that here there is a small area that looks gray. They are bilateral, so I'm showing it on one side, keeping the other side intact. There is an area, you can easily see it on the opposite symmetrical half also, which looks like this. There is also a similar area here. This is the internal capsule. This is the internal capsule. This small oblique V-shaped area. Now, since this is the internal capsule, we can easily recollect from our anatomy knowledge that we must have the putamen and globus pallidus on this side, the caudate nucleus on this side, and the thalamus on this side. This is the normal basal ganglia anatomy. So locate here, you can easily understand. This is the caudate nucleus. This is the lenticular nucleus or putamen plus globus pallidus, and this is the thalamus. And I'm again chalking out the internal capsule for you. This is the internal capsule. Are these structures clear? Is this clear to everyone? Great. Also see, cerebellum is about to end. So this small piece of cerebellum that you have here is probably the upper part or the vermis of the cerebellum. And by this time you have already moved up. So you are getting a piece of the occipital lobe behind. Now, importantly, there is one thing I want you to understand here. In CT scan images, unlike the normal anatomical correlate, the gray matter looks whiter and the white matter looks grayer or blacker. So in the CT scan, the gray matter actually appears white and the white matter appears gray. This is very evident from this diagram. If you see in this image, you know that the internal capsule is nothing but the radiating fibers of the descending tracts like pyramidal tract concentrated together. Now fiber means they are axon, so they must be white matter. And basal nuclei are basically nuclei, so they are cell body, so they must be gray in color. But instead we find that the basal nuclei areas are more whiter, the thalamus is more white, and the internal capsule looks gray. Can anybody tell me why the white matter looks gray and the gray matter looks white? So I said that the gray matter looks more white in CT scan and white matter looks grayer. So why is it opposite? Why is the density opposite? No, it's not about density difference. The thing is, it could have been the opposite also. My question is that only. Due to their which content? Yes, Tanvi? Yes, very good. It's because of the content of myelin. Understand one thing. We have seen in the Hounsfield scale of density that fat, air, and water tend to be black. Whereas absence of fat but more amount of calcium, electrolyte, cells, DNA, etc. will make up portion white. Now understand that the cell bodies relatively have less lipid, whether the axons are lipid rich because of the myelin. Because fat looks black in the CT scan, for this reason axons look black in a CT scan and the cell bodies look apparently more white. That is why when we talk about the gray-white differentiation, the white areas are actually gray matter and the black areas are actually the white matter, comparing with the morbid anatomy. I hope this part is also clear to all of you. So we proceed to the next section. Look into this section. This is a very interesting section. So if you look into this section again, in this section a number of images will be seen. So go one by one. From front to behind, we are cutting through the frontal lobe. So this must be the frontal lobe. Then you are cutting through the lateral ventricles. So these are the lateral ventricles. You're getting a better picture of the internal capsule here. And of course, there are structures related to that, the caudate nucleus, the thalamus, and the globus pallidus and putamen, that is lenticular nucleus. As you go behind and in the front also, you see there are some whitish structures, which are the folks or the invaginations of the meninges. They tell us whether we are taking the section in a perfect alignment or it is a curved section, because ideally both sides should be symmetrical. You can also see that in front we are getting the anterior part or the frontal part of the lateral ventricle, and behind we are getting the posterior part of the lateral ventricle, because the lateral ventricles are actually three-dimensional structures that project both in front and behind. Also, a central calcified area sometime will either indicate a pineal body or a choroid plexus. The most central structure usually tends to be a calcified pineal body. That is a normal structure. And if it is present in the ventricle, it is likely to be a choroid plexus. So I'm labeling them for you. This probably is a calcified choroid plexus because it is in a ventricle. And this probably is the pineal gland, which is often calcified. So from here, we come to another generalization, which is very interesting to remember. In general, the structures that appear white or hyperdense are number one, bone, number two, pineal gland, number three, choroid plexus, Number 4, this is pathological, so I'm writing it separately. Blood in any area. And that must be fresh blood, because as blood gets older, gradually there is a tendency that the blood can gradually lose color because of its metabolism and resorption. So bone, pineal gland, which is calcified, choroid plexus, which is calcified, are the normal hyperdense structures in the brain. Anything other than that can actually be blood, or it can also be a pathological calcification. For example, a calcified area or tumor. So getting back to the pictures that we were on to. So you understand how to identify this section as well. This is almost like the previous section. This is a section that is much higher up. So the entire lateral ventricles are seen here. So you can see the lateral ventricles, and you can see we have gone above the cerebellum. So this is the point where we are actually able to see the occipital lobe. We also have the frontal lobe in front with the invaginations of the meninges or the falx. These are the lateral ventricles. CSF looks black because it is water. And now, if we move on to the next section, this is a much superior section. So only the brain matter is seen here, as you can see. And here you can easily see, in front you have the falx again. Behind also you have that. These are the sagittal fissures. And above you can see a good gray-white differentiation. And please remember again, the white areas are the gray matter and the gray areas are the white matter. This gray-white differentiation is a very important indicator of integrity of the cell. When there is cellular edema or infarction or any kind of compression, the gray-white distinction goes away. So one of the early signs of an infarction of the brain will be loss of the gray-white distinction. So it's very important to understand how the gray and white matters are separately seen. If you go further up, you will be also able to see sulci and gyri, which is also visible here. So if you want to see the sulci and gyri here, these are the, I'll use a different color here. These are the sulci and these elevations are the gyri. So this is how sulci and gyri can also be seen. This area looks whiter, so this is the gray matter. This area looks grayer, so this is the white matter. And you can see the wonderful gray-white delineation that is seen here. So I hope this is clear to everyone. Okay. Let us check our understanding. Solve this. The dark structure labeled here represents what? Answer when you are ready. So all of you think that this is the fourth ventricle. And yes, this is the fourth ventricle. Try to solve this one. There are two white dots seen here. What are 1 and 2? Which is the right combination? So yes, the star-shaped cistern is the suprasellar cistern. Anything in the middle of it must be the pituitary stalk, and anything posterior to it can be the basilar artery. So probably the right answer is B, pituitary stalk and basilar artery. Very good. So see, this is the kind of anatomical correlation you need. You do not actually, for a clinical correlation, much details of anatomy are not needed. You need a clinical correlation with the signs and symptoms. That is actually more important. So we'll go to the next question. So our dark structure has been labeled here. I think the arrow has shifted. I'll re-label the dark structure for you. The question doesn't look good. So the dark structure that I was actually trying to label here was this. So on this side, this would be this. Please follow the narrower arrow. So what is this dark structure? Yes, it is D, the internal capsule. Very good. We'll move on to the next question. What is the dark structure that is represented here? This is a bit of a difficult question, but let's see if you can. Only a few persons have said E, none of the above. So those who have said none of the above, can you name the structure? I did not mention it in the previous slides. Yes. So the dark structure you see here, I'm labeling this for you. You have already seen that this is the internal capsule. If you look very carefully, there is also another structure outside which is dark. This is called the external capsule, through which a few fibers pass. We talk less about the external capsule. And those of you who thought I was talking of this, even this is not the putamen. This is also not the caudate nucleus. This is the putamen. So your answer, if referring to this one, will be putamen, but a more accurate answer will be none of the above, because the dark structure is actually external capsule. We'll move on to the next question. Try this. This is actually very easy. So the dark structure labeled here represents the lateral ventricle. Yes. What is this bright structure that is represented here? This is the pineal gland. This is the position of the pineal gland. And a very closely related question is this one. What is this bright structure? I just now discussed this. This is the choroid plexus. Yes. So a centrally placed structure is more likely to be the pineal gland. And the peripheral structures present inside the ventricles are calcified choroid plexus. Yes. This cannot be the pituitary, because had it been the pituitary, you would be dealing with the suprasellar cistern, whose shape is like a star. You don't see that star-shaped cross-section here. Next question. Okay, so next we go into interpretation of the CT scan. As I told you that once you are acquainted with the basic anatomy and the relation, the next step is to find out the pathology. And together with the anatomy and the pathology comes your radiological diagnosis. So what are the things that we start first? As with any investigation report, always check the patient name, the hospital number, the date of birth. The date and time when the scan was acquired. Is it an old report or a new report? Always look at the previous scan so that you have something to compare to. Is a lesion increasing in size? Is a lesion disappearing with time? So that is also very important. And when you describe the densities of the tissue, you can call them hypodense or low density, which essentially means more black. And brighter structures are called hyperdense or high density, or they are simply the whiter structures. So let us start. So how do we systematically go into interpretation of the CT scan? You know that chest X-ray has a few points to go through. ECG, in ECG we have a few points through which we go so that we don't miss a point. So what are the schemes through which we can go so that we don't miss a diagnosis on a CT scan? There is a very popular mnemonic that is used by radiologists that is called blood can be very bad. Blood can be very bad, and this blood can be very bad is a mnemonic for blood, cistern, brain, ventricle, and bones. These are the 5 things that you should check while going through the CT scan plate. So you go for evidences of bleeding. You look at the cisterns and see if there is any abnormality, for mainly blood in it. Look at the brain parenchyma, if there is any hemorrhage, if there is any shifting, if the white and gray matter distinction is there, if there is edema, if there is a tumor. Look at the ventricles, if they're dilated, if there is intraventricular hemorrhage, and look at the bones for evidence of fracture. I'll come one by one into all of this. Let us first talk about the first word, blood, the most important word on CT scan. In the brain, most common pathologies are cerebrovascular accident, tumor, rarely cerebral infection, and some congenital anomalies, hydrocephalus, and injury. So essentially we'll be dealing with these anomalies only, unless they are very rare. So what do we look for in blood? Blood can accumulate in different spaces. When it accumulates outside the dura mater, it is called extradural hematoma or epidural hematoma. When it accumulates below the dura mater, it is called subdural hematoma. When it accumulates in the arachnoid space, it is called subarachnoid hemorrhage. This is the hemorrhage where all CSF spaces can get filled with blood. Then if the hemorrhage is in the ventricles of the brain, it is intraventricular hemorrhage. And if it is into the flesh of the brain or the tissue of the brain, it is intraparenchymal hemorrhage. Now, hemorrhage when fresh always looks white in color. So a bright white color or hyperdense lesion, which is not bone, which is not calcified normal structure, must be blood unless otherwise specified. Be careful that you are not dealing with a contrast enhanced CT where the contrast will be brightly colored. Otherwise, in a non-contrast CT, which we are discussing today, blood is the most important pathology that causes hyperdense lesion. So let us see the different kinds of hemorrhages and their patterns in the CT. First, coming to the extradural hematoma. Now look at the picture, that is more important. Extradural hematoma has a tendency to compress the brain. So this extradural hematoma from outside the dura mater compresses the dura mater into the brain. And this compression typically causes a lens-like or a spindle-shaped accumulation of blood. And because it is blood, it is a hyperdense lesion. So this spindle shape is very important. This is the extradural or epidural hematoma. Because of this compression, many brain structures start getting compressed. And you can easily see here that there has been shifting of the midline. I'll draw the midline first. Join the two extremes and you get the midline. Now you see how the structures have actually got disoriented. This is how the midline has shifted. So there has been a midline shifting because of the pressure effect from this mass. So this is how extradural hematoma typically looks like. So it looks like a spindle-shaped mass on cross-section because it bulges into the brain matter by compressing the dura mater. And this can also cause midline shifting. Vital structures can get compressed and the patient will come with a neurodeficit. Is this clear? I hope you'll be able to identify an extradural hematoma or epidural hematoma. Okay, so moving on to the next type of bleeding, subdural hematoma. When subdural hematoma occurs, that is below the dura mater. Now, when bleeding occurs below the dura mater, this is the kind of shape that we usually get. We usually get a more or less crescentic shape. It is partly spindle shaped because, of course, of the circular shape of the brain, but it is more crescentic, more looks like a moon. And of course, it's white because it's a fresh hemorrhage. If this hemorrhage is there for a long time, gradually part of it will be absorbed. In some part, there may be fresh hemorrhage. In some part, there will be separation of clot and serum. So you will get patches of white, gray, and black areas. So I'll show you how an old subdural hematoma looks like. This is how the old subdural hematoma looks like. So see, this is the old subdural hematoma. You can see there are areas which are dense and also areas which are not very dense, which means there is a combination of hypodense and hyperdense areas, indicating the blood has been acted upon by the body's mechanism. It has been partly resorbed, or fresh hemorrhage has occurred again, or clot and serum has separated. So some kind of changes have happened, leading to a variegated appearance. In both the cases, one interesting thing is, because of the pressure, there has been midline shift. Here there has been midline shift quite obviously. In a similar manner, if you look into the previous picture as well, here also there is an evident midline shift. The two parts are not symmetrical. So midline shifting usually indicates compression of the brain, and that can result into a number of neurological signs. So now that you know how extradural hematoma, acute subdural hematoma, and chronic subdural hematoma look like, we come to subarachnoid hemorrhage. Now that is a tricky area. In subarachnoid hemorrhage, blood accumulates in the spaces where there is CSF. And because the whole brain is submerged in CSF, sometimes it so happens that the sulci will get filled up with blood. So how do you remember this? How is this peculiar pattern of hemorrhage remembered in clinical practice? See, when you pour water on a hill, it will settle into the valley. And that is exactly what happens here. When blood is poured onto the brain, then it will settle into the cracks and crevices of the brain and not on the gyri. So the sulci will be filled with blood and they will appear as a serpiginous line or a broad white line. So if you remember this simple analogy, that blood always accumulates in the valley and not on the top of the hill. So now you understand why in case of a subarachnoid hemorrhage, you will find that the sulci are getting prominent because they are accumulating blood. It's also important to know that even the various cisterns can get filled with blood because they are also filled with CSF, but that I will discuss under the point of cistern. That is also a subarachnoid hemorrhage. So is this clear to everyone? Are these three main patterns of hemorrhage clear? Extradural, acute subdural, chronic subdural, and subarachnoid hemorrhage? Okay. So now coming over to intraventricular hemorrhage. That is very easy to locate. You just look at all the ventricles in various cut sections of the CT scan. So you will see in one part, the ventricle shows blood. This was supposed to be the ventricle. And you can see a part of that is hyperdense. Here a part has been obliterated. It cannot be seen even. So this is an example of intraventricular hemorrhage. Bleeding has occurred inside the ventricle. This can affect any ventricle. So here we are only taking example of the lateral ventricles. Getting over to the next slide. Intracerebral means bleeding in any part of the brain. So some part of the brain has undergone bleeding and those areas are now looking white. So intracerebral hemorrhage will look like this. Here you can see there is a big arrow pointing to a part of the hemorrhage. Can you tell me which part of the brain has been affected here? Approximately which part? Can someone name the part that has been affected by the big arrow? This area. Yes, very good. Thalamus and part of the globus pallidus. It's mainly thalamus. So it's a thalamic hemorrhage. You understand that if the thalamus is involved and it is destroyed, there will be a lot of sensory features, motor coordination will be lost, and their patient can actually become very much vegetative in function. Now, coming to the next case. After B for blood comes C for the cisterns. So we have to understand what are the points to be seen in a cistern. There are four important cisterns: the ambient cistern that surround the midbrain, suprasellar cistern, the star-shaped cistern, quadrigeminal cistern that is adjacent to the corpora quadrigemina, and the sylvian cistern that is found across the insular surface within the sylvian fissure. We'll see them one by one. So you remember in this way. This star-shaped area is the suprasellar cistern. It is white because there is blood in it. This is the sylvian fissure. And therefore, this is the sylvian cistern that contains the CSF. This is the ambient cistern all around the midbrain. In the same section, we cannot show you the quadrigeminal plate cistern because that is at a different level. So I hope you understand how the cisterns are located. So I'll again draw them out for you so that it's easy for you to understand. This is the suprasellar cistern, the star-shaped cistern. These areas are the insular or the sylvian cistern. This is the midbrain. So the whole whitish area around the midbrain, that is the ambient cistern. This is the fourth ventricle. And we cannot see the quadrigeminal cistern here because it's at a different level. Is this clear to everyone? So you always look at the cisterns for evidence of hemorrhage because cisterns are connected to the subarachnoid space. If there is subarachnoid hemorrhage, blood will also somehow come here and they will also become hyperdense or white in color. Let's move on. Then comes, after blood can be, the next B is brain. And there are many things to see in the brain. So apart from those which we have already discussed under blood and cistern, what are the extra things that you look for? You check for sulcal effacement. What does it mean? It means that when the sulci and gyri are so compressed that they cannot be separated. So I'll show you what this actually means. Sulcal effacement means, you can see here, it's very difficult to say where there is a sulcus and where there is a gyrus. We can see, of course, there is a small sulcus here, a small sulcus here, but they are not as prominent as you see here. So loss of the sulci and gyri means the brain is getting compressed from inside. That can happen due to the effect of a tumor, or that can happen in hydrocephalus where the ventricular CSF pressure increases. So you look for effacement of the sulci and gyri as one of the signs, because it can indicate raised intracranial tension. Second thing that you look for is the gray-white matter differentiation, as I always told you, because an early sign of brain damage is loss of the gray-white matter differentiation. I'll show you what this actually means. On the left-hand side, you see this is a normal brain showing gray-white matter distinction. So I can actually roughly draw the boundaries. And remember that the white matter that you see here is actually the gray matter. And the gray matter that you see here is actually the white matter. So I think this is quite easily visible that the gray-white matter is distinct. Here you see the distinction is lost and it has become granular. This means that there has been some kind of cellular swelling or edema so that the axons and the cell bodies cannot be separated. They have all become a meshy mass. And therefore, gray-white matter differentiation loss is a very important sign of early brain damage that can happen in cerebral edema, in infarction, and in many other such situations. So what else do we look for? As I told you, look for shifting of the brain, midline shifting. Ideally, two halves of the brain should be almost symmetrical. I use the word almost because the CT scan may not be taken in a very perfect manner. So if the CT scan is a bit oblique, the two halves may not be perfectly symmetrical. But you can see they are almost symmetrical. On a simple observation, you know that there is nothing wrong with this brain. But here it is evidently the midline has been shifted and therefore this is not symmetrical. And that is also understandably due to a lesion that is compressing it. So if you look carefully, there is this lesion which is compressing it. Just asking you, can someone name this lesion? We have already discussed this. What is this lesion? Yes, this is a subdural hematoma, but what kind of subdural hematoma? Old or new? Yes, this is a chronic or old subdural hematoma because of the loculated variegated appearance and the crescent shape. It tells us it's a subdural hematoma that is old. Very good. So we move on to the next picture. Then also look for hypo or hyperdense foci. So what are the hypodense foci? Hypodense foci may be due to air, edema, or fat. So fat can get inside by fat embolism, or it can be a normal fat if it is outside the brain. Edema may be cerebral edema, or edema can also surround areas of inflammation. Like if there is a tumor, if there is an infection or abscess, if there is an infarction, surrounding that there will be black areas indicating that edema has happened as part of the inflammatory response. Also, air can get into the brain. That's a very rare situation, but it's very dangerous. Typically happens due to trauma, when air enters the brain by external trauma, and this is called pneumocephalus. Air looks pitch black on CT scan. So that appearance is very striking when you get air in the brain. It will look like pockets of very black areas in the brain. Hyperdensity, as I told you, is due to acute blood, thrombus, or calcification. They are usually hyperdense. Normally, hyperdense areas are the pineal gland and the calcified choroid plexus. So they are normally hyperdense in nature. So let's see a few pictures. So in this picture that is on the left side, you can see there are very dark black pockets. These are air bubbles in the brain. So it's a case of traumatic pneumocephalus, where air has gotten into the brain. Also, here you see, you can easily locate that there is a white area. This white area indicates hemorrhage. Can someone tell me which area of the brain has suffered hemorrhage? Yes, it is the lenticular nucleus and part of the internal capsule. So putamen, globus pallidus, and part of the internal capsule. Good. So if the internal capsule has gone on the left side, the patient is likely to have a complete hemiplegia of the right side. That is how the patient will present. And these apart, damage to the globus pallidus and the putamen can also lead to other movement disorders associated with this. Look for tumors under brain. Now, tumors can have different appearances depending on the histology of the tumor. Some may be hemorrhagic, some may be hyperdense, some may be hypodense. They can cause shifting of the brain to the opposite side. Some may be enhanced by contrast if they are vascular. So, how do tumors look? See here. So, in the first case, we see there are multiple tumors. We will not call it tumor because we have not done a biopsy on this patient. We will call them space occupying lesion. So there are multiple, at least 2 and probably 3 space occupying lesions in the brain that has caused midline shifting. You can see that the lateral ventricle on one side has been compressed. Here we see on the right hand side panel, there is a bright hyperdense tumor arising from the dura mater probably and compressing the brain. Probably giving you a hint, it's a meningeal tumor, probably a meningioma. But again, we should not comment without doing a biopsy. And meningiomas are often calcified, you know. They often contain psammoma bodies, which are areas of calcification. So they appear brilliantly white in color because of the calcification that they have. This is another picture of tumor. You can see there is a tumor with a variegated appearance. And there are areas of hemorrhage probably which are black in color. Or they may be liquefactive necrosis also. And this has caused a midline shifting. The ventricle on one side is almost compressed to a slit. The ventricle on the other side is more or less open. Here again you see a variegated tumor, a highly variegated tumor with probably central hemorrhage or calcification, which is white in color. The periphery looks dark black. Probably that is due to edema as response to the tumor. And there has been a severe midline shift. The midline has been shifted extremely to the left-hand side, and the cisterns have also been obliterated. Is this clear up to this? This tumor is actually also causing bone erosion. You can see a part of the cortical bone being lost. So then we come to the next word of the mnemonic. Blood can be very. Very stands for the ventricles. So we have already covered some of this. It's actually good to have repetition of points so that you never miss the points. Under ventricles, you look for intraventricular hemorrhage. And remember that the pineal gland and choroid are also hyperdense. Don't mistakenly comment that they are hemorrhages. So you see a normal picture on the right hand side showing the pineal gland and the choroid plexus, and an abnormal hemorrhage shown by red arrow on the left hand side. This is hydrocephalus. This is also what you see in the picture of under ventricles. See, the ventricles have been largely enlarged. And this enlargement, this pressure has caused compression of the brain cortex. Now, how do you know that the brain cortex is compressed? The thickness of the brain matter has decreased and the sulci gyri differentiation has been lost. There has been effacement of sulci and gyri. You cannot see gaps in the brain matter. So this indicates there is a raised intracranial tension. Had it been atrophy, then also the ventricle enlarges, but the sulci gyri become more prominent. So just to compare, I'm just telling you with the help of a diagram. If you are dealing with two different situations, one situation where there is atrophy and the other situation where there is increase in the intracranial tension, Now, if there is hydrocephalus, the ventricles become enlarged and the brain matter is so tightly attached that sulci gyri differentiation become difficult. They become very compact. On the other hand, in case of atrophic brain disease also, the ventricles become prominent, but the sulci gyri become more prominent, like this. This indicates there has been a cortical atrophy. So you look at the effacement of sulci and gyri whenever there is enlargement of ventricle. Then you can easily differentiate between atrophy and increase in pressure. So this is hydrocephalus because there has been effacement of the sulci and gyri. Finally, coming to bone, I told you about windowing. This is how windowed image looks like. We have deliberately changed the contrast so that everything looks dark, only the bone looks white. This makes the bone more prominent. This is called bone window image. Similarly, many other windows can be done. You can do a ventricular window, window for specifically showing blood. So windowing means adjusting the contrast so that all other things become less prominent. Only one particular type of tissue becomes more prominent. This is a bone window image, which is routinely done in case of head injury. So you can easily see here that a part of the temporal bone has been fractured. There is a linear fracture of the temporal bone. So bone window often helps us identify fractures. So this is what we see under bone. So to summarize, under blood, you look for different types of hemorrhage. In the cistern, you look for the presence of blood. Under brain, you look for gray-white matter differentiation, shift, hyper or hypodense lesions, and tumor. In the ventricles, you look for hemorrhage and hydrocephalus. And in the bone, you look for fractures. These are the steps to interpret the pathologies. Now, when you know the anatomy and the pathology, you come up with a diagnosis. For example, your diagnosis can be hemorrhage in the left putamen. That can be one diagnosis. Or hemorrhage in the lateral horn or the posterior horn of the left lateral ventricle. That can be a diagnosis. So is this clear? How do you approach to diagnose a CT scan image? So since this is clear, we can now proceed with a few examples. Let us test our understanding. Go through this. What does the image show? Write down your diagnosis. So we are split between B, C, and D, as I see from the responses. Let us try to solve them one by one. See, first of all, we can see this is the star-shaped cistern. It is unmistakable. So which cistern is this? What is the name of this cistern? Suprasellar cistern. Very good. Suprasellar cistern contains CSF, so it must be black in color. It should be hypodense, but it is white in color here. It is hyperdense, so there must be blood. That is the most common hyperdense material in brain. So blood in the cistern is there, so B is correct. Now, how did the blood get into the cistern? One possibility is that there are also getting filled with a subarachnoid hemorrhage. So the whole CSF space is contaminated with blood. So A and B are correct. Look at the outline of the bone, the white area. We cannot see any displacement or fraction. So C is also correct. So the correct option, the most correct option is D, all of the above. There is subarachnoid hemorrhage that has caused blood in the cistern. However, there has been no fracture or dislocation. And so D is the right option. I hope this is clear to everyone. Okay, we move on to the next question then. Try to solve this one. Wonderful. All of you have given the right answer. This is actually epidural hematoma. It's quite evident from the shape of the hematoma that this is epidural or extradural hematoma. We move on to the next case then. Try this. Again, all of you have given the right answer. This is a chronic subdural hematoma. What is very evident here is, if you see, there is a crescentic, almost crescentic hyperdense lesion, and it is also variegated. There are areas which are hypodense and hyperdense. So it is not an acute blood or acute blood loss. This is a chronic blood loss. So this is an old subdural hematoma or chronic subdural hematoma. Right. Move on to the next case. Okay, so most of you have responded D, some have responded B, and some C. Let's see which one is correct. Let us try to solve this. See here, if this is the normal color of the brain, then this is present in most parts. This part does show a hyperdense area, but we know that in the ventricle, if we get a single speck of hyperdense area, it can also be calcified choroid plexus. This is the midline. This is the lateral ventricle. Therefore, you have in relation with this the caudate nucleus, the internal capsule, the putamen globus pallidus, and the thalamus. You can see a dark area here. Dark area means it is not hemorrhage. Whatever it is not hemorrhage. So all the options having hemorrhage are ruled out. It is not A, it is not C. We are left with basal ganglia infarction and none of the above. Now this area indeed is the basal ganglia complex, and black can be infarction. So this is basal ganglia infarction. Is this clear to everyone? There are also more black areas here and there. That means there is multiple infarction. So I admit that it is not only basal ganglia infarction, but it is definitely including basal ganglia infarction. Clear? So this is the reason why I gave this case. This was a physiological finding. Calcified choroid plexus. Don't get confused with this. Choroid plexus and pineal gland can be calcified. They are not pathologies. Okay. So we move on to the next one. Try this one. Someone is asking why infarction is black. There are two reasons why infarction is black. If blood is white, then absence of blood means it's not white. So by default, the color is black. Second is, surrounding the area of infarction, there is edema, and edema means water. In the CT scan, water is also black. That is why infarction looks black. I hope this explains. So yes, many of you have gone for the option D. And we can see here that the ventricles are enlarged. That is quite evident. There are gross ventricular enlargements. But along with that, the sulci gyri have also become prominent. That means we are not dealing with a raised intracranial tension. We are dealing with atrophy. So this is cortical atrophy. It's a kind of picture that you get in senile atrophy, in Alzheimer's disease, in frontotemporal dementia. You get this kind of pictures. We move on to the next case. What is this case? This is very easy. So this is the case of severe hydrocephalus. Almost whole brain matter has been damaged, and it's all filled with fluid now. Fluid is black, and therefore it's totally filled with fluid now. So we are dealing with a case of hydrocephalus here. Yes, so the answer is A. We move on to the next case. Try this. So if you look here, let us try to solve this. The most evident wrong thing here is this, which is black in color. Therefore, we are not dealing with blood or calcification. The black area can be edema or infarction. We also see that there is no evidence of white and gray matter distinction here, indicating there is some pathology going on. So considering everything else, it can be infarction, which has secondarily led to some edema as well. Since edema is not in the option, so I will go with infarction. Can someone tell me what area has been infarcted here? Which part of the brain has been infarcted here? So we are split between parietal and temporal. What is the easiest clue to parietal and temporal? Temporal lobe hangs below. So if you get a cut of the temporal, you will get a cut of the cerebellum. If you don't see the cerebellum, you are probably dealing with parietal lobe. So this is parietal. There is no petrous part here. There is also no cerebellum visible. So base of the brain is not visible here. So we are not dealing with the temporal bone, temporal lobe, we are probably dealing with the parietal lobe. So this is the right parietal lobe infarction. Okay, so we move on to probably the last case of the day. What is this diagnosis? So let us try to solve the case. Many of you have answered correctly only. As far as possible to differentiate on a CT image, if we try to differentiate, see there are multiple lesions. These lesions look like rings. Probably they are not hemorrhage, because hemorrhage will not form such symmetrical pattern everywhere. But it is something that is hyperdense in nature. So maybe it is calcified. Also, it's unlikely that we will have so many vessels and choroid plexuses calcified everywhere, nor are we seeing any ventricles. So what other hyperdense material can it be? It can be a tumor. But looking at the nature of this SOL or space occupying lesion, you see that if you look here carefully, look here into this one or this one or this one, and you will see they have an appearance like this. A ring within a ring appearance. This typically means that probably we are dealing with multiple neurocysticercosis. In neurocysticercosis, the cysticercus often has the scolex inside it. When it gets calcified, it causes an annular appearance. The inner ring is the scolex, and the outer ring is the body of the cysticercus. Now, the diagnosis is not important here because that was not in the option. So the option none of the above is the correct option, because it is none of hydrocephalus, infarction, hemorrhage, or atrophy. So I hope this was clear to all of you. So I hope that you will, after revising this, be able to understand the anatomical locations in the CT scan and also find out the major pathology. And then together, when you combine the pathology with the anatomy, you get the radiological or neuroanatomical diagnosis. So as I told you before also, in tomorrow's class, we will do a systematic review of clinical cases. So I will give you clinical cases with a history, with physical findings and X-ray or CT scan images. And it is you who have to diagnose the condition correlating with the clinical conditions. So that's all for today. So Yachna, you can take over from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for this amazing session and for making this topic crystal clear. I hope everyone enjoyed this. And if anyone has any question, you can simply ask on our WhatsApp groups, and please feel free, and we'll divert them to sir, and we'll get back to you soon as possible. And also, in case you have missed out our previous lectures, it's already up on our YouTube channel, so please go and check them out. And there's an announcement to be made about the LGBTQ community. So Doctors for a Cause has been raising awareness and celebrating the Pride Month this June. We were thinking of how to get back to the Pride community, and we thought about an initiative. Healthcare is a basic right, and no one should be denied access to it. In collaboration with Scintilla magazine, that is a personalized magazine by students of NRS Medical College, Kolkata, we launched a petition that is aimed at inculcating knowledge about LGBTQ plus community in the course of medical education and provide the needs of Pride community in the very setup of healthcare. If you guys like our classes, if you guys like what we do, and you are interested in participating in what we do, please, it will just take less than a minute to sign that petition, and I'm sure it will help the people who will be benefited by this a lot. I hope you stand with us in this change, and we will be sending the link of this petition on our WhatsApp groups. Stay tuned for the PDFs and links for the recording sessions. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. So, thank you, sir. So it's me, Yachna Kabra, signing off.